Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Plattner. I'm the Vice President for Research and Studies here at the National Endowment for Democracy and co-chair of the Research Council of our International Forum for Democratic Studies. I'm very pleased to welcome you this afternoon. We have a very full program, so I will keep my own remarks brief. Think tanks, I am pretty sure, are an American invention, but they've now spread to every part of the globe. And they've played a particularly noteworthy role in many newer democracies. NED's International Forum serves as the secretariat for the Global Network of Democracy Research Institutes, which we sometimes refer to by its acronym NDRI. This network, which is affiliated with the World Movement for Democracy, joins together some 80 think tanks worldwide that devote a significant part of their work to issues relating to how to build and maintain democracy. While these institutes are committed to scholarly research, they also seek to have an impact on policy. So one of the issues with which all the members of our network are concerned is how best to translate their research into policy outcomes. This subject has been discussed at meetings of the NDRI, both at the biennial assemblies of the World Movement for Democracy in Jakarta in 2010 and in Lima in 2012, but also at a meeting especially dedicated to this subject in Seoul, Korea in 2011, which was generously supported by the Korea Foundation. Today, we're very pleased to be launching an online report that is the fruit of these discussions and much hard work and writing. The report, which is available on the NED website at www.ned.org/research, consists of chapters describing the experiences of NDRI member institutes from Argentina, Ecuador, Ghana, Georgia, Lebanon, Romania, Slovakia, South Korea, and Turkey. So as you can see, there's quite a geographical spread. The report opens with an overview essay by Christopher Walker, the Executive Director of the International Forum, which is also available today in a printed version. I think they're right outside. Chris will be moderating this afternoon's session, which will feature presentations by the heads of NDRI member institutes from Ecuador and from Lebanon. We're very fortunate to also have with us as commentators two policy analysts from Belarus and Egypt, respectively, who are participants in the SIPE Atlas Corps Think Tank Links Fellowship. This program offers talented young researchers an opportunity to learn from experts at leading U.S. think tanks and to develop skills that they can use to strengthen their organizations back at home. We're very grateful to SIPE, to the Atlas Corps, and to NED's own MENA and Latin American program sections for co-sponsoring this meeting with the International Forum. For those of you who are on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NED-events or by following the endowment at NEDemocracy. And now I ask you to join me in silencing your cell phones. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Chris Walker. Chris?
Well, thank you, Mark, and welcome, everyone. Mark alluded to the country set we have here, and I thought I'd just say a word or two about the composition of the countries we've chosen. If you use Freedom House as the frame of reference for this, you'll see that the countries are either weak or young democracies or middle performers, depending on your perspective. You might view them as semi-democracies or semi-authoritarian, perhaps in a case or two. But in any case, the ability to look systematically at the way in which think tanks operate in these settings, I think, has been useful in a number of ways. The operating environments, almost by the very structure of these countries, present different challenges, and therefore, I think it could be argued, should have different assumptions about what we can expect from think tanks in these environments, and perhaps we'll have a chance to talk a bit about that during our discussion later today. To give a sense of some of the relative challenges that these think tanks face in these specific countries, you have the limited ability, for example, of political parties to develop reform ideas and platforms in a way that you might see in more mature democratic settings. You have, more generally speaking, less developed policy communities, or as Orazio has described them before we started this conversation, policy ecosystems, and perhaps he can discuss that a little bit later on. And in weaker democratic settings, you see even more fundamental challenges relating to deeply rooted skepticism towards public engagement, which creates a host of its own challenges for mobilizing and getting more thoughtful discussion of public policy issues. And then one other point I would raise that came up in a couple of reports, and I thought this was an interesting observation. It's hard to say exactly where on the continuum, moving across the continuum from democratic states to middle performers and then into more repressive settings, where the changes occur, but you could say that there's actually a change in kind and degree. You have changes of degree when you're working in the more democratic settings. You're essentially fighting over you're fighting over small issues, but the system hasn't really, isn't in question. If you move into the more semi-authoritarian and authoritarian settings, the hurdles for achieving reform are far larger because you're talking about changing fundamental parts of the system. You're debating the structure of the government, and in some ways this is necessary, but it's also a very heavy burden for those who look to think tanks as being one of the key points for these sorts of discussions. In this regard, I commend everyone to two of the reports whose countries aren't represented on the panel. We have wonderful reports on Turkey and Georgia. Both of these countries are in the news for a variety of reasons today. Really smart analysis in these two reports. You can find those online today. I just cite three of the main findings that came through in these reports, and it really doesn't do justice to the analysis across the 9 countries and the think tanks operating in them. We don't have time for that, but there were many nuanced findings across these country reports, but I would cite 3 things that showed up in quite a few of these country reports. One was the power of civic education and the role of think tanks in this regard. Another was the importance of effective communication, and this is in ways an operational thing, but it really came through in many of these reports that you can do wonderful work with a lot of insights, but if you're not able to transmit it and communicate it effectively, especially in an era of information overload, you do yourself a disservice in the think tank context. And then finally, another dimension that was clear in quite a few of these reports was the importance of joint initiatives, and this revealed itself in the context of communication, at least in some respects, and that was more research and analytically oriented think tanks finding alliances or finding cooperative ventures with organizations that had more of an activist or a higher profile in order to propel findings and ideas into the public domain. So finally, I would say that in the larger context, there really isn't an argument that there's a need for more effective tools for reform and for sharpening thinking about policies around the world. This is very true in the transitional states of North Africa. It's a prime example, but not an exclusive one. I think it's also important to remember the experiences in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya will undoubtedly be repeated elsewhere in one way or another, given the popular pressure for more responsive and effective governance. And for this reason, it's important to think about ways think tanks and democracy think tanks in particular can do their work effectively. So I'd just like to take a quick moment to thank key staff members on this report before we move to the panel. An enormous amount of work went into this effort, generating the reports, coordinating them, editing them, and preparing them for release. So I'd like to thank Jessica Ludwig, Dean Jackson, Sukanya Banerjee, and in particular Melissa Ayton, who has seen this project through from its inception, and it wouldn't have been completed in the way it was without her hard work on it. And I'd also like to recognize Mark Plattner and Larry Diamond, who are really the founding fathers of this think tank network and of the forum. And without their oversight and brilliant guidance, there wouldn't be this sort of project coming out of these efforts. Finally, we have a terrific panel, and I'm not going to go through the entire bios. You have those. They really are impressive bios. It's terrific accomplishments by all the panelists. We have two report authors, as Mark Plattner mentioned. We have Orosco Venettini Cedeno, who's to my left, from Ecuador. We have Sami Atala to my right. They'll be speaking on their reports that appeared in the Democracy Think Tanks in Action report. Orazio is Executive Director of Grupo Faro in Ecuador. Sami is Executive Director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies in Beirut, Lebanon. We're also very, very lucky to have two commentators who are also think tank professionals who are part of the SIPE Atlas Corps Think Tank Links program. To my far left, we have Sally Rushdie, who's a researcher at the One World Foundation, and Maxim Karliuk, who's an analyst at the Belarusian Institute for Strategic Studies. So Sami and Orazio will speak for 15 minutes or so each, and then Sally and Maxim will follow their remarks with comments and observations. We'll have times for questions after that, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Orazio.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mark and Chris, for the kind presentations. Thank you to all of you for being here in this meeting. As Chris already said, my name is Orosco Venettini. I am the Executive Director and co-founder of Grupo Faro, a think and do tank that conduct research in different sectors in Ecuador and in some sectors with a more regional perspective. We like very much the think and do tank definition because it reminds us that ideas are not enough, that we also need to work on strengthening the capacities to implement them. However, this presentation is going to share with you the main findings of a report we conducted 2 years ago on how policy ideas emerge, how they are shared, how they are adopted or rejected. At the end of the presentation, I will briefly analyze the role of democracy think tanks, promoting the generation of ideas and enriching the public deliberation. The policy process in my country, in Ecuador, has been characterized by its political fragmentation and instability. Ministers still last, on average, less than 2 years in office. So that made it very difficult, as you might imagine, for a public official to use evidence-based research. By the time that the researchers have finished a policy papers, the minister that was interested in the results of that research might not be in office anymore. So the translation between research and policy is a difficult one in Ecuador. In addition to that, public information is scarce. When it exists, it's dispersed, highly technical, and consequently very difficult for policymakers, both at the national and at the local level to use. However, we found some cases in which evidence has played a key role in the policy process. And I'm going to try to draw some lessons and conclusions from those 2 cases I'm going to share with you now. The first one has to do with the fight against political clientelism in Ecuador. And that started in 2005 when several thousands of citizens took the street demanding that the president resigns. Among other accusations, media and social organizations claimed that the political party that was in power was using social programs for their political benefit. Since the new administration offered several reforms in April of 2005, Grupo Faro, the organization I work for, formed a coalition of think tanks and civil society organizations to organize a campaign against political clientelism. Grupo Faro created an index to measure the opportunities for political clientelism in 10 different social programs, the most important ones in Ecuador, and that index, that evidence opened a big conversation among different actors in the Ecuadorian society that made visible a phenomenon that was hidden at that time. Between 2005 and 2006, Grupo Faro worked with different social programs to increase the level of transparency and to implement other reforms to prevent clientelism in those programs. The second case is an innovative policy proposal. The Yasuní Natural Reserve is a 1 million hectare area located in the Ecuadorian Amazon rainforest. It's also a biodiversity spot. There are more birds and more bugs in there than in the whole Europe. So it's a huge biodiversity spot. Unfortunately, a few years ago, the Ecuadorian oil company, Petroecuador, discovered the second largest reserve of oil in that particular national park. Using the evidence portrayed in a variety of research, civil society organizations and universities developed a policy proposal to protect this area and to reduce Ecuador's dependence on oil income. The proposal includes stopping any new oil activities and road construction in this area, and asking the rest of the world to contribute with half the potential income coming from oil, approximately $3.5 billion. Even though it's an ambitious proposal, the Ecuadorian government is being promoted this initiative around the world. I'm going to try to analyze in the study, in the report we describe with some details the two cases. But now I'm going to try to summarize the factors that we think affect the impact of evidence into the policy process. The first one has to be with the political context. We understand in the report the political context as the environment in which decisions are made by policymakers. Both cases show that the political context could create windows of opportunity to use evidence in the policy process. In the case of political clientelism, Grupo Faro pointed to two opportunities linked with the political context. First, given that the previous government had been heavily attacked by clientelistic practices, the following administration was motivated to show that things will change. The second factor was that coming elections were about to be organized, and that created incentive for politicians to commit to reforms that in other political contexts will be very difficult for the political consequences. The international political context is also important. That is clear in the Yasuní initiative. At the time that the initiative was launched, the discussion in UNDP and other international organizations about climate change began to be very, very important. So that the Ecuadorian government had the incentive to adopt this policy proposal developed by CSOs and universities in order to portray itself as a promoter of innovative ideas that could change policy not only at the national but also at the international level. The second factor that we analyze in the report has to do with the importance of linkages and networks. Although the political context sets the scene for the implementation of policy reform, both cases, the political clientelism and the Yasuni ITT initiative, portrays the importance that play coalitions of academics, advocacy groups, and other kind of organizations in the use of evidence in the policy process. In the clientelism case, Grupo Faro supported the creation of a citizen coalition and a policy community of new public managers that agree on a new way to manage social programs. Using the evidence on opportunities for political clientelism, those new public managers were able to gain support from the media, from other political groups, and from citizens to implement those otherwise contentious and difficult reforms. The community of scientists that has conducted research for decades about the Yasuni and the biodiversity that was located there found a very important ally in advocacy coalitions that were promoting the same idea of keeping oil underground, and then the proposal gained from a combination of science and activism and increase the technical and political feasibility to be adopted both at the national and an international level. In addition, some of the members of the advocacy coalition joined the government, the Ecuadorian government, and that enabled them to transform the idea into a policy proposal. The third factor that we analyzed to understand the transition from research into policy is evidence itself. The nature, the source, the diffusion, and the use of evidence affects how research can play an important role in the policy process. After all, not all evidence is the same. There are evidence that is useful for policy designs, whereas the evidence that is needed for policy implementation is different. In the case of the political clientelism case, Grupo Faro was able to produce two different kinds of evidence. The evidence that allows the issue to be in the public agenda, that index that I described before, ranking the social programs depending on the opportunities for being used for political objectives, and the evidence in order to implement the reforms in the social programs in order to prevent the use of those programs for political goals. The other dimension that we analyze in this third factor is the source of the evidence, the source of the research. In some political contexts, research that is conducted by local actors is more likely to be adopted than the one that is produced abroad. For example, in the political clientelism case, the evidence came from an organization that was perceived as independent, non-partisan, secular, and that increased the potential of that evidence to be used for actors in different parts of the ideological spectrum. The third aspect of evidence that we analyze is how it is communicated. Both cases shows that evidence plays a more important role when the producers, the evidence producers, are able to address the right audience or the right actor. In the political clientelism case, the objective was to inform not only policymakers, but also general opinion, ordinary citizens. So Grupo Faro used community radios and mobile phones in order to diffuse information about the political and economic consequences of political clientelism, and that enabled the opening of this political and social conversation that made that issue to be at the center of the policy reform at that time. Scientifics in the Yasuni ITT initiative used a different strategy. They wrote direct letters to high-level authorities in the Ecuadorian government and international organization leaders that contain scientific evidence on why to preserve the Yasuni Park. So different strategies, but both share the capacity to reach the right actor, the right audience. We found in the report that it's very important to acknowledge that evidence is not politically neutral. It affects power relationship as much as power affects and shapes the research policy interface. The Yasuni ITT prove that research is not carried out in an ideological vacuum. On the contrary, it affects values and ideas, including political ideologies, religion, cultural belief, and in that case, it's very clear when the proposal included the use of carbon certificates in order to collect the money that is going to enable the Ecuadorian government to keep the oil underground, and part of the coalition split because they didn't believe in the use of market mechanism in order to achieve the goal. So it's important to have that in mind. Finally, I'm going to share with you very briefly three conclusions that we found in the report. The first one has to do with the importance of windows of opportunities. The thing is, and that is something that we know. The challenge is how researchers can increase their capacity to frame and to take advantage of those windows of opportunities. And we found two common aspects in the cases that we studied. The first one is that researchers were able to identify hidden objectives and needs in policymakers. Both cases show the same. In the case of the political clientelism, the new administration needed reforms that enabled them to show that they were doing things in a different way. So increase transparency and reduce the discretionality in the selection of beneficiaries was something that they needed for political reasons. In the Yasuni case, the Ecuadorian government needed a progressive policy proposal in order to show their commitment to the environment. And the second is how to connect. The second common aspect that we identify in the two cases is that researchers were able to connect evidence with public motivations. So in Ecuador, the Yasuni case was so widely adopted because the previous Texaco oil spills on the Amazon region. So that proposal was particularly fit particularly well with public motivations. The second conclusion is that the policy process is non-linear, nor sequential. Is the result of multiple interactions among different communities. And think tanks have the capacity to be brokers as Chris was mentioning in his introduction, to be bridges between or among those different communities and to create a space for identifying common goals. And the third conclusion is that narratives are more important than evidence. Think tanks, we as think tanks are very good producing and analyzing data and producing short messages because we have in mind that policymakers don't have time to read, long papers. But what we found in the two cases is that they create a bigger narrative that was able to attract the social and the political attention and imagination and engage actors that otherwise will remain outside the conversation. So we found that researchers in those two cases have the ability to see and to connect statistics and facts with a bigger story that enable policymakers and civil society organizations to participate using this new narrative. Finally, something that is very important in the two cases is the role of democracy think tanks. They are active participants in the journey from evidence to policy because they can pack and analyze information. They can promote a space for more informed and plural conversations, and they can increase capacities in other organizations, governmental and non-governmental, to design, implement, and monitor public policies. The challenge, according to our study, is to recognize that think tanks are not just there to analyze data, but they are also a very powerful tool to generate ideas, to create big conversations, and to improve the quality of policies and to inspire new practices that create a more vibrant democracy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Orazio. A lot of food for thought there. And now we'll hear from Sami Atella.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me here in DC, and thank you, Ned, for initiating this project. This project is as much about us as much as it is for us. And maybe give me a few minutes to explain what I mean by that. When the Ned contacted us back in 2011 to start this project, it actually forced us to reflect and document how the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies that I currently direct turned a research idea into a national movement, which effectively we were able to reverse a government decision and force it to hold municipal elections after 35 years of absence. So it's one thing to actually discuss with your colleagues in the office and to reflect on this. And it's a different story when you're actually writing it out, because when you're writing it out, and when we discussed it in Korea, which was a wonderful meeting of think tanks, really was very useful for all of us to really sit down and really see what works and what doesn't. The report is also very useful because we also hear and read about other countries and other think tanks in other countries, what problems they face. And in a way, I'm very glad that Orazio is saying and talking about the fragmentation and the challenges they face in Ecuador, which I think is very similar to what we're facing in Lebanon. So it's really nice to have this dialogue as well. And I think it's also useful because for the younger generation in my country, when they read something like this about an NGO or a think tank that actually pushed or pressured the government successfully, I think it could serve or it gives hope and some confidence that things can change, at least under certain conditions. As one colleague of mine at the American University of Beirut, when she heard that I'm writing this paper, she said, "Oh, it's great. At least I can give it to my students, and they can actually read about this." So again, thank you, Ned. I'm not advertising, and I wasn't asked to advertise the report, but really, that's how I'm very thankful for that occasion. I think I'm going to start to give you the context and what we were up against as a think tank, a non-governmental, non-profit, non-partisan, non-sectarian, working in Lebanon. And this think tank was established in 1989. And the incident I'm going to be discussing essentially is early 90s up to 1998. But let me start with this. The last time the Lebanese government held municipal elections was in 1963. And their mandate was for 6 years. When 1969 came up for elections, the government decided to postpone it for, apparently, security reasons. And then some of you, or many of you, would know that Lebanon's civil war in 1975 to 1990 was definitely not an occasion to hold any election. But then the story doesn't end here, because in the post-civil war period, that means after the 90s, the government, the central government, has decided to actually postpone the elections again for no strong apparent reasons. But what this showed us as a think tank and as civil society, that the government, despite the normalcy of life in Lebanon, there's no appetite for political reform. And by that time, I should mention that the municipal councils, back then there were 700, half of the municipal council members who were elected in 1963 were effectively dead, you can imagine. So these municipalities were under the control of the central government. So the central government saw no need to, let's say, encourage political participation at the local level or have any political dynamism. But I must add a footnote here that the political elite, the national political elite, disagreed on this topic. Although the final decision was not to hold the election, there was an internal disagreement. Not because some parties felt that for democratic reasons we should have local elections and others didn't think so. No, the calculus was different. The ones that were in favor of holding these local elections, because they saw that they were actually could strengthen their national agenda, and the others felt that they would be weakened. The conclusion was, with the Syrian in power effectively, or having the final say in Lebanese political affairs back in the early 90s, the decision was postpone the elections again. Now, this actual decision, which took place on April 3rd in 1997, prompted civil society to act. And the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, LCPS, led this movement and called with 100 other organizations a meeting. In the first meeting, which was held effectively exactly 2 weeks after this decision, had 15 NGOs come together to decide on what to do. And 2 weeks after that, an action plan was drawn, and they decided they're going to launch a campaign to lobby the government to actually enforce it to hold municipal elections. And indeed, a few months later, in August 1997, a national campaign actually took off, covering all Lebanon with 100+ NGOs and civil society organizations, until they forced Parliament on December 22nd, which is 9 months later from the date of the decision to postpone and cancel the elections, to reverse that decision and hold municipal elections for the first time in 35 years. And finally, the elections was held in June of 1998. I'd like to synthesize the 3 main lessons learned from this. One, we need to have, and the reason we've succeeded, let me just rephrase this, is that we had by 1996, when the government, or 1997, by the time when the government decided, we didn't just simply walk up and decided to lead a campaign. We've been doing our work. So there's definitely a need for a policy knowledge and vision of what to do. Does civil society organizations, do they know, do they have policy alternatives? and what are they? And so it's very clear that civil society, it falls upon us to actually do our homework, to think creatively, and to have ideas. So the center in 1980, which was established in 1989, has actually launched, as soon as it was established, two major initiatives that it thought that are very important for Lebanon. One was electoral reform, and the second is decentralization. So between 1990 and 1996, we had already produced maybe 2 books on each topic. We've convened researchers, journalists, scholars, MPs to discuss and debate how we can move the country forward, despite the political stalemate in the country. Effectively, by doing that, not only we have sort of started developing our ideas and our vision, indirectly we became a hub of activity that included all these profiles of people by interacting, discussing, debating, collaborating with them. And this actually, indirectly, and without maybe explicitly or being fully aware of this, it created some sort of a common sense or common identity and a common purpose, which effectively led to a common action. The second component within that, I think it's very important for us as civil society to read the political situation on the ground and to take advantage of political disagreement among the political elite. Now, elites tend to disagree, but they're often on the same page, at least in Lebanon, on many issues. When there's a disagreement among the elites, it's a great opportunity for civil society to strike. But for it to strike, it has had to have developed its ideas and done its homework. So here I just want to qualify the conditions under which we operated. On one hand, we've been researching, writing, collaborating, and thinking. And then in 1997, when some parties wanted elections and local elections and others didn't want to have elections, and although the decision was not to have it, this we were able to capitalize and make an opportunity out of this. So I think that's very important to read this so we don't really think we're operating in a vacuum, or we think and delude ourselves that we can always make a change. I don't think so. But when there's a disagreement, there's definitely an opportunity, and it's up for us to actually capitalize on it. The second important lesson learned is that the research center that I work at, that actually has led all these initiatives in terms of policy research and analysis, realized that it cannot be the one doing the activism on the ground. So what the founders and the directors and the people in that center, what they decided to do is to create another NGO whose mandate is to actually lobby the government to hold elections and to monitor elections, national and local. So what they created is something called LADE, which is the Lebanese Association for Democratic Elections. And this was incubated at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. We hosted it for a couple of years. Now it's a sister organization that's totally independent. But the fact of the matter, we decided to split our roles. One carries the role of the researcher, and one carries the role of the political activism. And our knowledge, our research feeds into their work, and at the same time, their work feeds into us, until today, in fact. We were just meeting 2 weeks ago to discuss what we do about the elections. You know what I mean? How do we think together about the local, well, now they've been canceled or postponed for two more years, but that's another story. And in that sense, by splitting these roles, LCPS maintains its research capability and its independence and doesn't compromise its commitment to that. And in fact, LADE is actually allowed and set free to actually mobilize. So this is, I think, is a really important. Plus, I should mention that the people who do research don't have the same skills as the people who do activism. So, and we need to acknowledge that. And I think, it was very clear to us, we do what we're good at, and you do what you're good at. We cannot carry the 2 hats, and neither should you. So I think that's the second role is the division of labor. It's a joint work, but divide the roles and responsibilities. The third point is strictly about the campaign itself, how it was managed, how it was led. And I think here the key message is to stay focused, despite many, many temptations. And I should mention here that when the civil society organizations met and discussed from April to August, there was a lot of pressure to say, look, it's not only about local elections we need public freedom, we need democracy, we need better judiciary, and there were demands by certain organizations to include them on the list of demands. Now, here's the thing. On one hand, these are legitimate demands, but they threaten the campaign. By now, we're adding so much on it. So there was a very conscious decision not to include all the other things. Just say one message, which is hold municipal elections. Clear. That was clear and simple. And in fact, they succeeded to ensure the cohesion of the campaign. Plus, I should mention that they decided that no member of that network would be running in the elections. So not to show that we're in fact, we're actually partisan to all of this. The second, within that sort of strategy, it was very conscious to use petition, and we collected 60,000 for Lebanon. It's pretty big. I mean, let's just put things in perspective. This is a small country, you know, 60,000 people. I know you probably get it in one little town in the U.S., but for Lebanon, it's huge. And there was definitely a logic for that, because constitutionally in Lebanon, you know, you don't need government approval to have a petition, but you do if you want to do protests or any other, you know, public activities. So we decided by doing that, we shift the political debate at a level where the central government cannot control, which is really public opinion. So I think that was a very sort of important sort of strategic decision. We've enlisted many, many NGOs, so it doesn't look like, oh, we're just acting upon it. And we've actually approached political parties. And that was actually a key strategy to show that we're not actually partisan, and we've invited them to join the coalition, and we've asked that everyone who joins the coalition has no right to carry any party flag, to strictly hold the elections. We don't care who wins the election, as long as we ensure that this right is actually exercised. And the last one is the importance of the media, which played a major role in promoting and advocating in our favor the whole movement, as well as engaging with the reformers, I should say the MPs who are friends of the center and who've managed to actually become interlocutors with the political institutions and particularly the parliament. So I think in a nutshell is to say that for successful campaign and for a research center to actually mobilize and get the government to actually do and reverse its decision and hold elections is, one, have the vision and the policy knowledge, and including that, we should include in that taking advantage of the disagreements among the elite. Number two, I would say, is to split the roles and make sure what each party or each civil society is good at and divide that role and work jointly. And lastly, is to have a focused campaign. You know what I mean? With no ads on, or not trying to be overly ambitious, and stay focused. And on this point, I'll end my discussion. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Sami. You noted the space you had to interact with political parties and the benefit of open media. I think if you move in the more repressive direction, you find that those windows would close a bit, certainly. And perhaps that's something that our commentators would speak on. I'm very happy to introduce Sally Rushdie, who's going to be the first to offer some comments, and then we'll move on to Maxime.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for having me here. Actually, regarding the experience of Ecuadorian Center and the Lebanese Center, I see that both of the experience raises really good practices of the effective think tanks that small think tanks have to learn from. So thank you so much for conducting the report. It is very useful and helpful for the nascent think tank. I have just some comments on the first report on the Lebanese Center. Actually, the report raises, as I said, the good practices and the best practices that we have to learn from. And regarding the Lebanese Center, you know, it is located in the same region of Egypt, so we have like similarities and some different issues that I'll illustrate during this presentation. The first thing that the report mentioned that, before the war or whatever, the Lebanese policymakers before the war failed to develop state institutions, laws, or governance practices in ways that would preserve the country. And here I see that we have the same with the Egyptian case. Unfortunately, one of the most obstacles or challenges that facing think tanks in Egypt right now is regarding the institution itself, decision maker themselves. We haven't good institutions that work or operate freely within the unstable political scene. So actually we have the same circumstances that we have unstable political scene in Egypt right now, which make the our work at think tank more difficult in this respect. Also, I agree with you on the point that when you said that politics is not only an art, but also a science that requires dedicated and sustained study. That we need to learn as think tank in developing countries. And decision makers themselves have to learn and to know that the politics is science, not only art or games that we can manipulate to do or to gain more gains, but the politics is study and science that decision makers themselves and think tanks have to study and elaborate on. The other point is related to the establishment of the Lebanese think tank. You mentioned that in the beginning of your think tank, you received support from local business philanthropists. But in the Egyptian case, philanthropy is only going to the charities organization, not think tank organization, because unfortunately we haven't the culture of think tank within the society or community in Egypt. So philanthropy is used to go to the charities, not think tank. And here we can raise the problem of funding for think tank in Egypt, because it is difficult for us as a think tank, or especially for small think tanks, to raise funding from local individuals or from philanthropy. Actually, we are surviving on international donors, and unfortunately we are going to have more restrictive law and NGOs that will make the situation difficult. So you are lucky that you have philanthropy in Lebanon. Hopefully it will be in Egypt. So another point is related to, and here I can ask Sami about this issue. You mentioned the publication which named Abad, and you said that in which you publish groundbreaking research on Lebanon's identity, politics, economics, and environment, judiciary. So I feel like there's so much field. So how you can tackle with this big area of issues, or you are focusing only on small issues that's easy for you to deliver on? Also, I noticed that in terms of advocacy, you as center, you had to create new entities or agencies to take over the responsibility of advocacy. As you mentioned, the three entities that you mentioned before, like LADI and Lebanese Transparency Association. So here, in the Egyptian case, only we have in the think tank, you can have department for maybe called Media and Advocacy Department within your think tank. So maybe because or due to the circumstances of funding, so you don't have the capacity to create a new entity to deliver on this responsibilities. So we have problem with creating a new entity or entities to take over the responsibility of advocacy. But in your case, you had done more, the three cases you mentioned, which is good in your case. But in the Egyptian one, it is difficult for us to have separate entity from the think tank to take over the responsibility of advocacy that I want to mention, because as I said before, maybe due to the funding limitation or something like that, and maybe as well due to the culture of our perception to the think tank role. In our case, for me as well, in my think tank, we perceive that our think tank have to advocate for the research findings, not only to have a separate entity or to give the findings of research to another entity or coalition to advocate for it. So we have to advocate for our findings by ourselves, which is different from your case, as you mentioned. Another thing is related to, and here actually the experience of both the centers, as I said, raises best practices of the effective think tank. Here, for example, when you said that your scholars and experts of the center had worked with the government in terms of like providing consultancies and working as experts with the government. This point is very good as think tank because, you know, one of the measures that you gonna like measure the impact of your think tank through having requests from the government to like provide experience or consultancies. So requests for public posts or even the requests for having consultancies from the think tank, it's one of the most important measurement to measure your impact as think tank. Another point is related to, this is very important for us as a small think tank. You mentioned that your work showed that much could be done with a good idea, basic resources, and a small but committed staff. I agree with you. Good ideas is very important for the think tank, and you have to have basic resources to do your activities and committed staff as well. But you know, the reality of the Egyptian think tank, it is different because actually we only have the part of good ideas. So the small think tanks in Egypt or the environment itself like push the people to have creative innovation and innovative ideas. But we haven't, as I mentioned before, we don't have like constant resources of funding and basic resources of funding, which is a problem for our work. Another thing is, as I mentioned here before in another roundtable here in Ed, that small think tanks in Egypt is still lacking for the qualified and committed researcher or staff. So we're still like struggling to have full-time committed staff and qualified at the same time, maybe due to the poor salaries that we are giving to the researcher due to our limited funding. That's why one of the biggest challenges that we are facing in our think tanks is related to the core funding or the sustainable funding, not only the project-specific funding. Okay, so other thing is related to the change and the decision makers themselves. As you mentioned that maybe Al-Taif agreement, according to Al-Taif agreement, the decision maker in Lebanon like gonna be changed in terms of the authorization of president, prime minister, and so on. So here I'm wondering if the changes decision maker themselves can affect the approach or your traditional way of approaching decision makers. For example, in Egypt, before the revolution, we used to deal with or to elaborate on the problems facing the ruling party in the old regime. And after the revolution, we have new ruling elite and new ruling parties. So how we can like change our approaches of dealing with decision maker according to the nature of decision makers themselves. So it is like just a point for us to debate. Do you have?
No.
Okay, I'm just okay. I need to wrap. Okay. Another thing is related to, as you mentioned as well in the end of the report regarding the, you maybe said that one or two of your board members like went to government or something like that, as or were ministers. And here's this point is very good related to think tank because it is like reflected the theory of revolving door. Theory of revolving door is one of the most principle of think tank. Here we can see that you at think tank have like good staff or good scholars, and then the government can ask them or you can nominate them for official posts, and they went to the official posts, they can come back to your think tank and like provide you with the practical experience that they had been gained from the government. So this series is reflecting the revolving door, one of the most important principle of think tanks. Here, all of this idea, I just want to make sure that all of this idea actually reads that you have best practices in your think tank. We as small think tanks in Egypt or every way we need to learn from it. And it was like your award to be mentioned in the Global Think Tank survey. It's like normal to be mentioned there after your effort at think tank. Only the thing related to the Ecuadorian one, the biggest lesson that I learned from the Ecuadorian experience is related to the research is not enough, or gathering evidence is not enough. And actually, I totally agree with this idea, because we as think tanks, we don't only required to make research, but we need to like advertise our research or our findings of research. So like creating communication strategies is a very important thing for think tank to make sure that the findings of research or the views of the think tank is going to be in action by the decision maker. So actually all of that idea was helpful for me as a researcher and nascent think tank. Hopefully we can like collaborate further to make sure that we can learn from it in a good way. Thank you so much.
That was great, Sally. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, if you want. Most of the comments were on the Lebanon report, so perhaps Sammy will take a moment just to respond to the parts of it he's.
Sure. Sally, thank you so much. And you've really touched upon really key issues and ideas. Let me just sort of quickly reflect on the 5 or 6 points that you've mentioned. Indeed, when the center was founded, it was actually some scholars, intellectuals, and some businessmen. Now, we still face this issue of, and just sort of reflecting on this, what it took for Lebanon, for the center, I think 2 businessmen to convince to get into this. This is what it took. One who gave us an office space, and the other one who became the chair.
I need their contact.
But that's about it, in fact. So how do we engage the private sector? And I was just talking about this just before here, that we're doing, for example, now fundraising dinners, we're attracting the private sector to come and contribute with no strings attached. And I don't think we have capitalized on this in the last 20 years. It's just that first, when Paul Salem, the founder, and Elise Salem started it, they have contacts with 2 key people, and they got them excited. And this is, I think, relating it to your the Egyptian case, how businessmen or women and the private sector gives money to charities, and it's very logical for many, many reasons. But for think tanks, it's very abstract to give money to. What's a think tank? What do you do? We give what do you guys do in a think tank? Yeah. I mean, what's this? So you do research? Oh, yeah. So what? Big deal. So whereas charity, great. You buy political influence. You're well known to the party. You show they're a big contributor. You have political power. Think tank? Come on, what do you do, guys? So that requires. I think it's going to be sometime. So be patient, Sally, and don't worry. Hoping you'll find the right private sector. On the advocacy, let me clarify here. Indeed, the center has created 3 NGOs, and now they're totally separate, independent organizations, because we think that there are 3 key issues that really require a full-time work. One is LADE, which monitors elections. One is Lebanese Transparency Association, which monitors and lobbies for clean government and anti-corruption. And one LCRN, which is the Lebanese Conflict Resolution Network, which deals with networks. But now, this is because this is a full-time job that they do. We do have our own advocacy, for our projects. So that we maintain, but when it comes to monitoring elections, having a national movement, following up, this is a different. We're distinguishing the roles here because that's a different ballgame, and we prefer not to do that because the people who run think tanks and work in think tanks are different from the people who are on the ground and pushing things and doing activism. So that's the strategic thinking behind that. As for the consultancy, indeed, that's useful to have us going into government. I was a researcher at the center between 1997 and 2000. And I returned as a director in 2011. But when I left in 2000, I actually served in advisory capacity with several governments, the Ministry of Finance, Industry, and the Prime Minister's office. And this was really interesting experiences to see how things work or don't work from the inside. So here we are as think tank, we're looking at we make a lot of assumptions. We think that the people in government actually do much more than they actually do, So we're like, so I just wonder what's going on in there. And look, you go in there and wow, it's shocking how much work is not that. But then part of the reason is that, and I think in any government, is that government employees generally in bureaucracies are not, they're not paid actually, and the jobs are not to think. And they're not meant to think. You know what I mean? Only central bank maybe have like a research department, and maybe the Ministry of Finance in some countries have, and they provide some interesting, but most don't. Now, in a country like that, in addition to that, the others just, even the policy formation is just ridiculous. And I can give you some anecdotes later on in the Q&A about that, but I don't want to waste the time of my colleagues as well. Now, Sally, the issue of money and funding, now we're still struggling with that. Money doesn't come easy still now. My job is to keep on fundraising, to think of good ideas, to approach donors, to make sure it's aligned with our mission and so forth. So this is a work in progress, you know what I mean? Okay, things are not terribly bad, but obviously money is better with no money. But here's the thing, money alone does not make a think tank, for sure. You know what I mean? Without this dedication and commitment to it, there's definitely how much money you pour in, it's not going to go very far. As for the Ta'if agreement, yes, it did change the decision-making process, or distributed the power among the political elite. But the relationship between citizens and politicians did not change much. So what we saw is like a distribution at the national level among the political elites, particularly the different political communities, the Sunnis, the Christians, and the Shiites, and their different the different power structure between the presidency and the Speaker of the House and the Prime Minister. But citizens sort of being accommodated or participatory or have a voice, no, nothing really. As for the think tank and the revolving door, look, let me just say I have mixed feelings about that. I don't think it's all good, because on one hand, it's good to have us or board members or LCPS going to government. I think that's hopefully, we're given the chance to make changes, but we have to be careful not to be co-opted, because the best way to kill a policy is to get one board member from any think tank and make him the minister of whatever, and that's all brings a lot of excitement, you know what I mean, that we're going to change things. But guess what? It was a strategy to co-opt and kill this whole initiative. On one hand, the government gains because it shows that it's modern and reformist face. So we have just got someone from the civil society. But he didn't do it. He couldn't do it. He failed or whatever. So we have to be careful about being co-opted. And once out of power is to make sure that we don't succumb to political pressure for political reasons or political aspirations of the members, and some like to come back to politics, and hence do we self-censor ourselves? And I think I'm very adamant that this should not happen, because it sort of kills or comes at the risk of the credibility and the commitment of the think tank. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And Maxim, perhaps you can give us some perspective from an even tougher landscape, some thoughts on what you've heard and how this reflects on the Belarusian case.
Right. Thank you a lot, Christopher. Thank you, Razio and Sami, for your great presentations and your reports, and thank you, Sally, for your comments. Yes, as I was asked by Christopher, I'll basically present a bit about Belarus, the situation in Belarus, as maybe not many people are well aware of what's going on there. So just brief history. So Belarus was part of the Soviet Union, which broke up in 1991. It was Belarussia actually back then. Then it changed its name after the fall of the Soviet Union to Belarus. But the change of name didn't really change much in the country, as you can see. But as the country has been ruled by one person since '94 until today. He's in his fourth term now, and kind of, like the West generally saw the situation deteriorating in terms of political freedoms, freedom of speech, etc., etc. And also economy, basically. There was not much change, as long as like 75% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises. So there was not much privatization going on. So generally, in this kind of and Russia is like main ally again, and now they are planning to build this Eurasian Economic Union by 2015. So they want to show it like sort of European Union, but to the Eurasian side. We'll see what happens with that. So basically, think tanks, they operate in Belarus in this kind of framework when there are no not real political freedoms, freedom of speech, etc., etc., and reform economies. Basically, there is a lot to do, right? There is a lot to do, a lot of thought to produce, and also I liked Rezio's comment on think and do tanks. Yes, a lot of to think about, a lot to do. There are think tanks in Belarus, but the thing is, the last report, Global Go-To Think Tanks Index 2012, they counted 12 think tanks in Belarus, which sounds kind of funny if you have in DC here like around 400 or so. But we're a small nation, and there are actually many reasons why we have so few, and they're quite small. And one of the reasons is political situation. I mean, basically the government doesn't really seek for independent advice. It doesn't really trust anyone independent from the government. So yeah, and basically what think tanks are left to do to find out what is problematic and provide with some thoughts about it. One of the sources to do so even though on official level they are not interested in independent sort of research, independent ideas, but there are lots of informal contacts, even like on high level, and through this informal communication. I don't know what's the case in your countries, but through informal communication, there are lots of requests to show what to do in these other cases. But these are mostly in non-politically sensitive fields, like economy, for instance, because everyone was in crisis recently, and some are still there. So there were lots of requests, informal requests on this situation. And also was happy to hear from Sami that actually in the government, think tanks over there, they actually look when there is a conflict within the government, right? So to see where they can step in and provide with ideas. Well, actually in government in Belarus, you're not really allowed to think differently from the general trend. So basically there are lots of conflicts in the government. If there are very few, then you don't really know what happens to those people who try to disagree. But I mean, well, there are actually conflicts, especially during the financial crisis. There were some like different ideas going on, and it was actually a good time for think tanks to step in and to provide with some like even more ideas. And there are some success stories from our think tank as well, Bruce Institute for Strategic Studies, which actually in these periods of these small conflicts on these kind of turbulent times, they actually even introduced some of our even legislative changes, but they again not in politically sensitive parts like social issues, philanthropy issues, whatever. So not really like the ones that Western countries push Belarus to reform. So the main problem is policy environment, as I mentioned. Also political parties. Actually, a new development here in Belarus is that political parties tend to have now these research arms within themselves, which is quite interesting now. And new think tanks appear in Belarus as well, kind of year after year. So there are more than 12 now. What about the sponsorship, about philanthropy that has been mentioned here on this panel? So basically, think tank, they do not fundraise in Belarus domestically inside the country. First of all, it's difficult in a way that businesses or other private entities, they're kind of afraid of doing so because they know how governments what government actually thinks about independent think tanks. Some economic think tanks which produce like ideas only on economy-related issues, they do get some domestic funding, but they are not related to fundraising. It's mostly like private contracts with some businesses. So mostly the problem in Belarus actually dependence on foreign donors. This is kind of problematic issue, but in the end there is no much alternative as we can see currently. So it's one thing that also has been mentioned here was cooperating with, also in the reports, cooperation between think tanks in order to have like much higher leverage to produce better results, because sometimes the think tanks, especially they're small, as in Belarus, it's sometimes hard to do things alone. So there was a recent initiative which is quite good, I think, which is a Belarusian Research Council initiative. So basically trying to unite think tanks under one umbrella and try to have some certain fields where we would work together. It existed for several years, but it was kind of very informal, and now we're trying to institutionalize it, hopefully to get better results. Right, so there are some, as I mentioned, there are some good cases when there is cooperation with some even ministries, so like even formal cooperation, but those are again related only to non-politically sensitive issues. So the main reform agenda which is needed in Belarus, like in terms of political freedoms, privatization, etc., these issues are not usually perceived and not even sought by the government from independent think tanks. So thank you, and looking forward for your questions.
Thank you very much, Maxime. And I would just note, in the Belarusian case, Belarus is not only one of the most repressive countries in the former Soviet context, but it's routinely ranked among the most repressive in the world. And the Lukashenko regime's self-isolation has really distorted the policy ecosystem for that country by virtue of its ability to communicate in a meaningful way with the outside world and create reforms. In any case, we have about 25 minutes for questions, if you have them. If you can raise your hand, identify yourself, your affiliation, and we can take a few, and maybe we'll bundle them later on. We have a question right here in the front.
Hi, my name is Saad Ansari from the Yale Journal of International Affairs. Sally, you mentioned political science, and something I've always wondered is the role academia plays in think tanks and policymaking in general. And from all of your work in think tanks, have you found modern academic production too esoteric for use? Have you found it very useful in guiding your policies? And what would you think think tank relationships are like with academia? I'm kind of going back into the other side of knowledge production.
Would either one of you like to start?
When Chris was mentioning this knowledge ecosystem, in the case of Ecuador, and this applies for other Latin American countries, it is clear that think tanks need strong universities in order to influence policies for several reasons. For the one that you just mentioned, universities are more equipped to produce more basic research, but in addition, because universities are the ones that produce the people that is going to be working on the think tanks. So you have weak universities, it's very difficult to have the right environment for think tanks to work well. But that is a relationship that hasn't been studied, the relationship between universities and think tanks. Do they compete? Do they collaborate? Under which conditions do they work together? So I think that's an issue in our research agenda, how to understand those relationships and how to promote those relationships, especially in countries in which those ecosystems are still poor, in the sense that there are not many organizations, knowledge producers in that case, both think tanks and universities, and on the demand side, there are not knowledge users, in the sense that public institutions still don't use evidence and research in order to make decisions. But that part of the ecosystem, the relationship between universities and think tanks, is a very important one, and I think we need to understand that relationship, both context-specific and in different regions, in order to find comparative features.
So just to make sure I got your question right, is you want to know sort of the role of academia and how useful it is for us? Because I mean, I'm thinking on tools and methodology, or is it more on the substance? Is it?
Basically, any way you'd like to take it.
Okay.
Specifically in terms of the research and knowledge produced in universities.
Okay. Sure. I think I'll answer that in two ways. There are two levels. I guess definitely the work done in academia, particularly on the methodology. You know what I mean? I think we're very strict on that, which means essentially we have to apply the same rules to do research and to understand a certain relationship, let's say. So whether we're doing focus group or we're doing questionnaire writing, you know what I mean, or we're doing analysis of the surveys, these have to, or the whole methodology of who do we study, who do we select, do we take this municipality or this one, do we randomize, do we not randomize? And to understand the problem at hand, we really have to abide by these rules, otherwise we cannot claim that we actually found the source of the problem or the factor that's leading to certain X or Y. So that's on the tools and methodology. On the substance level, I think the academia has been helpful, at least some work. I mean, that the one work that comes to mind is the more recent work of Ricardo Hausman at Harvard on industrial policy, particularly, and what he and his colleagues created something called the product space, which means they've mapped out all the products exported in the world. You know what I mean? And they saw the relationship between each and how close or how far they are from each other. So we've applied this on Lebanon. And actually, interestingly enough, we found out that between 2000 and 2008, Lebanese industrialists, and Lebanon is not known for industrial sector, by the way, have created 40 highly sophisticated products. Well, if we didn't go through that methodology, we would have never really known. And in fact, we're trying to understand how the industrialists actually managed to create and discover, quote unquote, to how to produce these products despite the absence of any industrial policy. So this is a case whereby academic work, in this particular applied to a think tank like ours, actually is helping and informing us on this relationship between the 2000 and 2008. And our role right now is we're taking that information to understand and investigate why. I hope that sort of answers your question.
Other questions?
If
I'm
I
sorry,
may
Maxine, go
to
ahead.
make a quick comment, in Belarus, the relationship between academia and think tanks is, you can see it as a good thing, on one side at least, because actually one of the reasons why think tanks exist there is because people from academia actually come there, and the main reason for that is ideological. So they cannot find self-fulfillment in Belarusian universities for ideological reasons. The research they produce, therefore they come to think tanks to continue their research there.
And I think Sally also had a thought.
Yes. Okay, for me, in my perception, we know that one of the most important role of think tank is to bridge the gap between academics and decision makers. So, for example, when I'm gonna to write policy paper on one of the pressing topics, so I can ask the academic professor to write policy brief to produce it, and I can provide the decision maker with this policy brief. But the academic writing is different from the analysis of think tank. So my role here at think tank is to convert the production of the academic, which is characterized by this is long and very cited one. So I can convert it from long writing to small writing and understandable for the decision maker. And here you can have consensus with the academic or professors themselves to do that. So you have the authority at think tank to review the writing of the academic with agreement with the professor, and then you can provide the decision maker. The decision maker was reliable and understandable policy writing. So it's one of the sources that we are dealing with academics in our case.
I think we had a question here, and then we'll go.
Thanks. I really enjoyed hearing what you had to say. Orazio, when you mentioned that think tanks help develop the dialogue or the narrative with which policy can be put into action, and then for Sammy, when you discuss about how the think tank how your think tank activities help push this kind of the change to create the vote. I had a question though. What is the role of other entities like the media, for example? How do you differentiate the think tank role comparatively to the media or in this country political action groups that don't have as much of an academic backing to them? And how do you create that differentiation? How do you also, in your research methodology, separate that kind of influence? Because when you say that the think tank has created this influence and has pushed this information out to the public, how public was that information? CNN has I hate to say it, but CNN probably has a larger effect or a larger audience in this country than the Brookings Institution because of the people who watch CNN.
Or at least
So-
it used to.
Yeah, exactly. But for each of the countries, it's also within that paradigm. So just kind of curious as to how it all works out.
So I guess the question is also, we can take that one, how you decide where your added value is. I guess that's part of it. If you wanna go ahead.
I think the role of the media is extremely crucial, and to put it broadly, I think having an effective communication is very important. I don't think at the center we took it very seriously until maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, become active. So now we actually have a position we created 3 years ago in communication officer. You know, before that, well, we're just too busy doing research. We don't have time to, you know. But in fact, we were very wrong, because half of the work is actually communicating it. You know what I mean? The first half is just, you know, we do it. But you know what? It's so frustrating you do it and no one hears about it, you know? So our job, in fact, is to actually articulate our ideas. To do that, we need to create the right product. When we write a book or we write a chapter or a policy paper, you know, it's just not going to, if you send it to the media, you know, forget it. It's not going to go very far. So we've decided, okay, well, we took one step extra and we started creating policy briefs. 4 or 5 pages on a key issue that summarizes or synthesizes. But even then, I think that's really wasn't the right thing for the media. So we moved on to an 800 word. You know, like, look, 800 words, that says it, you know. That has been very successful in the sense every time we write something, we send it to the media and they publish it right away. We're excited about it, you know. Yeah. So just to get our ideas and thinking. And now we're very conscious, like we started actually measuring these things. Before, you're like, you know, it's good to be in the media, fine, you know. Now we're much more sort of concerned and like, because we want to, look, we want to have our opinion, our position stated and communicated. And I think we need to do much more on social media as well, you know what I mean? And this is a whole different topic, but you're very right. I mean, half the work is just, I mean, if you just do it and you don't communicate it, it's really lost work, you know what I mean?
I like very much Maxime's reflection on how do you advise governments when governments doesn't want to be advised. And, you know, it's that's our goal, to influence public policy, and government doesn't want to be influenced, so that's a challenge. And I think, you know, when we are thinking on influencing policy, we have to be clear that one way to do it is from a top-down approach, talking to the government, talking to the decision maker, communicating our research results, and to influence how she or he made that decision. But the other way to influence policy is the bottom-up approach. You know, citizens mobilizing for an idea, citizens mobilizing or pushing for a reform. And in countries in which governments don't want to be advised, the bottom-up approach, you know, become more and more important. And media is very, very key for the bottom-up approach. The traditional media, the way that we understand it, but other, you know, new channels of communication, social media, mobile phones. Those are the other channels that think tanks have to learn how to use in order to mobilize from the bottom up political and social pressure and consensus for reforms. So the role of media, the old and the new media, is very important, especially in those political contexts and environments.
I think we had a question here, and then we can come back. So the woman who's sitting, Dean, on the aisle.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Neda Zuhdi. I work with the project on Middle East democracy. I'm just wondering if each of the panelists could speak a little bit more about the relationship between activists and advocacy organizations and more traditional research institutes. I think all of you have commented on it to some degree, but I'm particularly wondering if you think that the nature of the policy issue you're trying to have an impact on could determine what the division of labor should be between the kind of activists and advocacy organizations and the think tanks themselves. Are there particular issues where it's more appropriate, perhaps, for think tanks to do more of the advocacy themselves versus other issues maybe where they should work more in coalition? So if you could just speak to that question.
Sort of this question, which is very interesting and sort of connects to what Oritio and Maxime were talking about, that in the countries we live in and we work in, there's really no demand, right? So we need to create that demand. And because the battle is not a battle of ideas. This battle is different, it's elsewhere. So to do that, we obviously need to go the bottom up, which I think is crucial. Which also means that just to remember and remind ourselves that we need, as civil society, to do our work. You know what I mean? And so it's not something that comes so easily and so forth. As for the division of labor, once you think about it from this logic, you need to have a coalition. Obviously, the bigger the coalition, the better. Despite that, you're going to run into problems, have different ideologies. Some are sectarian, maybe, and some are secular, and how they're going to work together. So you have a whole different ball game among civil society organizations and the battle that takes place. Some don't like each other, some don't want to cooperate, and what have you. I mean, it's not all lovey-dovey down there. It's not, So now, in terms of the way I see it, I don't know about whether it's really a function of the nature of the era, unless you have something more specific, But the way I'm seeing it, conceptually at least, since you have a think tank that actually think and do research and analyze data, you know what I mean? And they need to sort of give it to the activists, you know what I mean? Then they can help jointly together, because I don't think anyone has enough the resources to do both, and as I mentioned, the different kind of skills. So that's my quick answer to your question, unless you have something very particular about a certain sector, which I somehow it escapes me.
Thanks, Nada, for this question. The answer is it depends. So it depends on the issues you are working on. It depends on the audience, your audience. It depends on the tools that you will use to affect your audience. So, for example, if you are working on issue of freedoms, so activists here is crucial component of your advocating process. So it depends on your audience. As I said before, for example, if you're gonna be affected the legislators, so you need to provide them with legislation draft. If you will going to affect the, for example, in Egypt, the NGO law, so you need to have the activists or human rights activists in your advocating process, because they are the most aware of the issue, the most aware of, or you can consider them the beneficiaries of the law. So it depends in the issue that you are working on. Another idea is related to, you compared activists versus advocacy. So I feel like we cannot compare between them, because advocacy is process and the activists is components, or the people that you can include in your campaigns or you're advocating. So activists can be part of the advocating, not a replacement for the advocating itself. Thank you.
And I think we had a question here. We have a mic coming up.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your clear and illuminating presentations. Ruben Perina from Georgetown University. You probably answered this question before, but I just want to have maybe a more precise response. See if I can get it. How exactly do you get governments, given that government perhaps do not know what they are doing? How exactly do you get them to adopt your policy recommendations? Do you do any training in terms of to get your policy recommendations to be implemented? And how do you monitor whether they are implemented or not? And finally, is there any and how sustainable they are? Thank you.
Those are big questions.
Big question. It is the goal of our think tanks.
You want to start, Razi?
Yeah. Well, that's the biggest question. That is the one. And unfortunately, there are no a single answer. I'm sure it's not the answer that you wanted, but it all depends on the political context. That everywhere change every time, especially in democracies that are in the process of consolidation. To influence policies is not the same at the central government. The strategies that we use at the central government are not the same that we use at the local governments. The power relationships, the level of the intensity of citizen participation is very different at the local level. So the bottom-up approach is easier to use at the local level. It depends on the sector. It relates to the question you asked before. It of course depends on the sector. A reform in a fiscal sector, with a high level of technicities, have to be an expert-centered strategy, to hire the best one in that particular field to write the paper, to do the analysis, because people is going to listen when he or she, the expert on fiscal policy, is going to make the recommendation. Whereas in social sector, in health or environment, maybe we need like a more participatory process to develop a policy proposal. So unfortunately, I don't have a single strategy, but I think the only rule is that there are no rules, and to be clear about that is very important to be effective.
I'm not going to even try to be precise. But let me just speak from experience. At 2 points, the government approached us to actually help out. One, to draft a one electoral law in 2005, and a decentralization law in 2012. In the 2005, after years of advocating reforms, the government set a committee to draft a law, and 3 of the 7 members were from my think tank. And they designed what we call a sort of a hybrid law, that includes, and it stopped right there. They didn't adopt it. It still remains on paper and so forth. Now, was this a waste of time? Well, how do we evaluate it and so forth? I tend to think of it as actually a good reference. Now we have actually a law that we can advocate for. We've actually written it. We can keep on reminding that there's actually a law already out there. So the center now doesn't even work on electoral law because we've written one. How many times can we write a law, essentially? The second one is on decentralization, which I'm a member of. And look, we've been in from November till today, putting this law together. Taking 12 to 15 hours a week sitting in these committees, working outside the committees, for the committees. And sometimes I feel like, on one hand, it's great that we're putting our fingerprints on this law, and on the other hand, I'm saying, is this a complete waste of time or what? You know what I mean? So I'm battling between those 2 things, and I say, okay, look, at least, we're given the opportunity to write our thoughts, and hopefully it becomes a reference in the future. So now I joke with my colleagues. I say, in 2070, they might say, well, in 2013, some guys made some sense, Just to say all this, to say that, in fact, there's no way we can force the government to adopt any policy. And because, you mentioned training, but I think just to zoom out, we sometimes assume the problem is technical, that they just don't know. They just need the qualifications. I think that's not the issue. I think the political interests, that actually hijack or prevent any changes. So maybe it's just about when the time has come, when the idea has come with time has come, they might sort of resort to these draft laws or to the center, But there's nothing much we can do, frankly. But be ready and prepared to give advice or draft a law, until we have some sort of maybe a revolution, and then you have, but even with revolutions, in fact, what's showing it, even in revolutions, the political actors that come to power tend to want to or at least maintain the same system. Because look, I mean, the best system is to be autocratic if you're the dictator. I mean, just to ridicule it, But so I'm sorry that we're not able to be very precise.
I'll maybe repeat myself at one point. So one way you do is through informal contacts within governmental ministries. So that works sort of well in our case. Another way is just go and knock on each and every door, also in official institutions. And if you know that this or that institution, you are not really, your institution you're representing is not really welcomed in this institution, just cover yourself like with another name or something, or you represent yourself or not like as individual researcher, and this works as well. And often it's actually, I mean, we always invite all the relevant governmental institutions to our events, etc. And then it's often about if you find the right person or not. So there might be people within the ministries who are interested in this or that topic. Like in my case, one presentation, there was one person from a governmental institution present, and she was so interested in the topic, and she even arranged the same presentation in her institution. So in order to spread this idea she liked among her colleagues. So again, it often depends on whether we find the right person. Thank you.
Two of the reports we have in the overall study are on Slovakia and Romania, which are the two EU countries there. And it's very interesting to note the ways in which the two think tanks that did their reports adapted their strategies. In the case of Slovakia, in the late 1990s, they were still battling against what was effectively an illiberal, semi-authoritarian regime, and they had a certain strategy that was oppositionist in nature in many respects. And then once an election in calendar 1998 brought more open-minded, consensual governance, that think tank adapted its approach to things. Likewise in Romania, which had a tough environment, deep corruption, as they moved closer to the EU membership, they were shifting their strategies and the sorts of issues they focused on. So I think it's a reflection of another thing I heard during the discussion here, which is just fascinating, is the importance of having very sound assessments of the political landscape, and it's probably a whole nother discussion of how small NGOs can manage this sort of decision-making. How do you do that? Is it part of your normal project strategy? Is it part of board strategy? Is it something that the executive director is tasked with and carries the ball on? But here too, it really requires a lot of thought and shrewd and accurate political analysis to find out when the space is opening. And I think that was just one piece of really terrific presentations by all the panelists. And I'd like to express my deep thanks to Sally, Orazio, Sammy, and Maxime for their insights and for fielding a wide range of questions. Thanks to all of you as well. Thank you.